let's move on to talking about adjustment layers, a little more about layer masks, and about selections. Okay? Take me just a moment here. I'm going to get some more density into this image. I'm not trying to make an overly pretty picture with this one. I'm just trying to demonstrate how to think about adjustment layers, how they relate to masks, and also how selections work in that whole thing. So when I come in here and let's say apply a filter to this image, maybe what I'd like to do is blur the image. I'll come in here and use blur. And first off, when I look at the blur filters, notice that only some of them have 3 periods after it. Those are the adjustable blurs. The ones that don't have 3 periods after it just give you a preset amount. So I'm limiting myself to the ones with the periods after it. Then we have a whole bunch of different kinds of blurs. And some of them have names that seem a little more obvious than others. The one that seems to be the one with the weirdest name is this one, Gaussian Blur. Well, there was a guy that had a last name that it might have been Gauss that invented a way of thinking, and they named things after him. Gaussian Blur. This could have been called Wilmorian Blur if they named it after me. All it means is an adjustable blur in this case. So anytime you want an adjustable blur that doesn't have any fancy way of working, but it just blurs, Gaussian Blur is where you want to go to. I'm going to choose that. And what I'm doing, I'm just going to blur this image so you really can't see the detail. Kind of like that. Click OK. Now, when you apply a filter to a layer, it usually affects the entire layer, unless you have a selection active. So let's briefly talk about selections. I'm going to choose Undo here, and we'll apply that filter a second time, but this time we'll make a selection first. There are many different selection tools in Photoshop. One of them is the Marquee tool right here. And since the Marquee tool has a little triangle in its corner, it means there's more than one tool hidden in that slot. I'm going to use the elliptical marquee because it makes ovals and circles, and here we have a subject that might be appropriate for that. I'm going to come in here and click and drag and see what we get. There we see we got this kind of oval shape, but it doesn't line up with our subject. And that's because if you think about how this particular tool works, it's kind of weird. I'm going to start clicking in the upper left corner of the document just to show you how it works. And then I'll drag and look at the selection I'm getting when I let go. It's nowhere near the upper left corner of the document. That's because it's thinking about a rectangle. Imagine this circle or oval, whatever I'm getting, is contained within a cardboard box, just a rectangle. Well, where I first clicked is one corner of the rectangle, and where I let go is the opposite corner of the rectangle. And that's how it's thinking. Which means to select this particular object, I need to act as if it's contained within a rectangular box. So if that was the case, then I need to take this top edge and kind of go over this way and take that side and go up, and the corner of the box would be somewhere up here. Does that make sense? That's where I'm going to click. And then I would drag to where the opposite corner of the same box would be. And by doing so, I should end up with a selection somewhat close to this. There's a trick, though, when you're doing it, because it's not usually going to perfectly line up. And that is, as long as you have not released the mouse button yet, then you can adjust this. Usually, you can just move your mouse, and all you're doing is changing where the lower right is of this selection that you're making. But if you want to change the position of the whole thing, as long as you have not released the mouse button, you can press the space bar. I still have the mouse held down. And when I hold down the space bar, I can move the whole thing around. So therefore, I can reposition and get the top edge to line up with the top edge of the object, get the left edge to line up with the left edge of the object. And when I get the top and the left edge, I let go of the space bar. Because that's what I had defined with the very first click, was kind of the top left. And now I can resize this thing and get the bottom and the right side to line up. There. Now I got a selection that's pretty darn close to this. But doesn't it make it much more useful to know you can press the space bar to reposition it? Just don't let go of the mouse button. Hit space bar, reposition it, let go of space bar, but leave the mouse button held down. Then you can continue moving the mouse to continue changing the size of it, and only when the size and location are appropriate should you let go. It takes a little bit of practice to get that down. So now if I were to come in here and apply the same filter, the Gaussian blur filter, instead of blurring the entire picture, it's now only blurring the area that's selected. Anytime you have a selection active, it means this is the area of the image I've isolated, so whatever it is I do, I can only affect that part. If I grab the paintbrush and try to paint, I'm only going to paint inside that selection. Even if my paint stroke extends beyond it, it will get cut off. It won't show up. If I make an adjustment by going to the image menu and choosing adjustments, it's only going to affect that part. What I actually want in this case, though, is the exact opposite of what I have. I wanted to blur the surroundings, not the middle. So I can go to the select menu, and there's a choice in there called inverse. Inverse means giving the opposite. And so when I choose inverse, instead of having the center of the image selected, I'm going to have the entire outside. And I can tell the change is happening because look at the outside edge of my document. You see the little moving edge called the marching ants? So now this area out here is selected. I go to the filter menu, I choose blur, and I've now blurred just the outside. So the selection limits where something can happen. Now, let's see how the selection works and how it relates with masks, because there's a bunch of things we can do. First, I'm going to select inverse to get back to having the circle selected. And let's look at a few features. I'm going to go to the select menu, and there's a choice in there called save selection. Choose save, and I'll say middle circle thingy. So I remember what that selection is of. Then if you want to get rid of a selection, you can go to the select menu and choose deselect, or you can just click away from that selection with a selection tool, where it thinks it's going to create a new selection over here, but you never drag to define how big of a circle you get. You just click and let go, where it's like a circle of a size of 0 is what you got. So either go up there and choose deselect, or click outside of the selection with a selection tool to say, start a selection here, but you never dragged enough to tell it to be of any size, so you get nothing. So I'm going to take this image now, and I'm going to choose Save As. And when I choose Save As, I'm going to choose a file format of TIFF. I'm not going to use JPEG. JPEG can't save any extra stuff in it. JPEG is a finished file format. I give it to people when I'm done with a picture. It's not a working file format. Working file format would be TIFF or Photoshop. All right? Default settings. And now I'll close it. Now if I open it again in the future, I'll just go over here and say Open Recent. Hopefully that top file is the last one I used. I didn't give it a good file name, so we'll find out. There it is. If I want to get that same selection back, I can go to the Select menu and I can choose Load Selection. And there's a little pop-up menu here that would give me a list of any selections that I've saved. Since I've only saved one, it's selected by default, and click OK, and I get that selection back. So if you ever make a selection that took you some time, you might think you need to use it later, you want to go up to the Select menu and choose Save Selection. Store it in your file. When you need to get it back again, choose Load Selection. There'll be a pop-up menu where you can choose all the ones you've saved. Okay? But where does it go when you save it? It seems like when you save it, it just magically saves somewhere. Well, it actually goes somewhere where you can go look at it to see how many of them you have saved and what they look like. And that place where you go is called the Channels panel. If you have your Layers panel open, right next to it is usually grouped in channels. If you don't find that there on your screen because you messed with stuff, if you ever need any one of these panels and you can't find it, if you go to the Window menu, this lists every single one of those panels you could possibly have. So if you ever mention a panel and you can't find it on your screen, go here to find it, and it would show up. But if I go to Channels, Do you see it down at the bottom? There are two kinds of channels in Photoshop. These channels are actually what your picture is made out of. I don't know if you remember when I mentioned, when we were in Camera Raw, I mentioned your picture is made out of three colors, red, green, and blue. And I mentioned that when we were moving certain sliders, we might have started to lose detail in one of those, or two of them. And if we lost detail in all three, we had solid black or solid white. Well, that's the actual info. You can actually see it. That's your picture. For most people, they ignore that, because that's for techie folk. But down here are saved selections. And saved selections have a name. They're called alpha channels. So if you ever go to save a picture and you notice a checkbox right down here called alpha channels, see that? And it's on. It's sitting there. It means you have saved selections in your file, because that's what they're called. That's just a techie term that they never turned into a friendly term. Okay? So it means that all pictures that you open will have these channels up here, because that's literally what your picture is made out of, technically behind the scenes. Most people ignore it because they don't want to get into that kind of technical realm. But when you save a selection, it gets saved down here, and to say that they're different than the part that makes up your image, they're called alpha channels. And so anytime you go to save your image, you got to be careful if you've saved those selections, because if you choose a file format that does not support alpha channels, that'll be grayed out, and there'll be a little triangle next to it warning you. It's a little warning triangle. And that warning triangle usually means you're losing something by using this file format. Just like before we saw that triangle next to the word layers, that's when we had a file that contained layers, and we used a file format that didn't support them. Well, the same thing is true here for alpha channels. Alpha channel means saved selection. Okay? So if I choose Photoshop file format, it can handle them. If I choose TIFF file format, it can handle them, and some of the others can. But Photoshop and TIFF, those are the two main working file formats. Meaning if the next thing we're going to do is open our picture and do more work on it, those are most likely the file formats my image will be saved in. Okay? And that's why you won't see me using JPEG for most anything until I'm done with the picture and I want to deliver it to somebody else. That's when I use JPEG. And that means strip out all the stuff that was needed to make this image and just save the end result. And make it kind of small, file size wise, because I'm done. I don't need any extra info in it to do extra work to the file. I just want to deliver it. Okay? So if you captured your image in JPEG file format, that's fine. When you open it though and start working on it, I'd save it as a TIFF and then do all the work. And when you're completely done, you know you don't need to make any more changes. You might save out another JPEG as your end result or to deliver to people. So that's an alpha channel. Doesn't that awfully look close to a layer mask? Well, let's load that as a selection. So we get that back. Let's go to layers and let's add a layer mask to that layer. Well, if you have a selection active, at the moment you create a layer mask, the selection gets converted into the layer mask. It gets used to produce a layer mask. And what it does is it assumes you only want to keep the area that's selected and you want to hide everything else. So I'm going to click on the layer mask icon. Now, no, in older versions of Photoshop, you can't add a layer mask when you're working on the background because it's locked. You'd have to double click on the name and change it to something else, anything you want. That lock would go away and then you could add a layer mask. In the newest versions of Photoshop, they finally realized after like 20 years of time that it's stupid to have to rename the layer. So they made it so you can add a layer mask to the background layer. And all it does is change the name for you. Okay? So you can now do it in the newest version. But do you see what just happened? That selection got converted into this thing, a layer mask. And you remember with a layer mask, black hides things, white makes them show up. So the area surrounding what was selected is gone. It still exists in my file. You can see it right here in the layers panel. It's just that this thing's hiding it, the layer mask. So anytime you hear the word selection, and sometimes you hear the word mask, They can do similar things. They can look the same. And it'll take you a while, but in general, they're somewhat of the same thing. A selection is a temporary version of something that isolates an area. Selection temporarily isolates this area. But if you click somewhere else, it's gone with a selection tool, and you didn't save it. You could go to the Select menu, choose Save. Now you saved it in your picture. Anytime you save a selection, it looks just like one of those layer masks. It just happens to be in the Channels panel. That's where it is. Now we've just connected one. We've attached one to a layer, and it looks like that. So let's see how we can use a similar concept to try to isolate one of these guys in here. I'm going to make a selection with a different selection tool. This time I'll use the lasso tool. The lasso tool is what you use to make a free-form selection, one that you just draw. I'll just draw a terrible shape like that. Do you remember when we had a mask attached to a layer, and I hit the backslash key, and it showed it as a red overlay? And when it was a red overlay, I could paint on it? Well, you can do the same thing when you have a selection like this. It's just you don't hit the backslash key to do it. Instead, you press the letter Q. Q is actually a shortcut for clicking an icon that's in the lower left of my screen. You see this icon right here? That thing? It's right below your foreground and background colors. That thing. It's called Quick Mask. So if I have a selection on my screen and I type the letter Q, it's going to change the selection temporarily into a red overlay. That's called Quick Mask. So I'm going to type Q right now. See the red overlay? And if you looked at that icon that was below my foreground and background colors when I typed Q, it just got pushed in. I could have just clicked on it with my mouse to do the same thing as hitting the letter Q. Now I can modify this by grabbing my paintbrush tool. And if I come in here and I paint with white, it removes that red stuff. If, on the other hand, I were to paint with black, it would add that red stuff. The red stuff indicates an area that's not selected. So the part of the picture that looks normal is the part that is going to be selected. And so Quick Mask is something where you can take any selection you ever have, you can type the letter Q to change the way that selection looks so that it looks like a red overlay. And then, in order to change the selection, you grab your paintbrush and you paint with black or you paint with white to modify the selection, because you just might feel more comfortable using painting tools instead of using selection tools. So I'm just going to paint a little bit here to try to isolate this particular object. And when I'm done, and I want to get this back to being a selection, because this thing called Quick Mask Mode is a temporary thing. It doesn't get saved with your picture, and it can't do anything by itself. It's just a way of viewing a selection temporarily. I'll hit the letter X to paint with black. Where when you're done, you type Q again, and you get a selection back. And the selection's been modified just like this red overlay has been modified, so it's in the same shape. So I'll just hit Q to turn off. See how I just selected that object by painting using something called Quick Mask Mode. I'm done selecting. I might want to use that in the future. I see one little spot I missed here because I see a little area. I'll hit Q again, and there's a little piece of red there. Then when I'm done selecting, I can go to the Select menu, choose Save Selection, and type in a name. And now I saved that on the file, so if I ever need it back again later, I can get it back. So I could, if I want, deselect if I don't still need that. But it's saved in there in case I want to get it back. Right? Where is it saved? Channels panel. You see it right there? It's called Fishy 1. Right? Question?
How do you determine what softness to use on your brush for that?
Try to match the softness of the object you're attempting to isolate. So if that fish there was in motion, so it had motion blur to it on the edge, then I would think about how wide is the motion blur, and that's how wide of a softness I want on my brush. If the edge of that object is razor sharp, then I want a razor sharp brush. And so it's a matter of trying to match the edge quality of the thing you're trying to isolate, if that makes any sense. So if I go back to channels and you see where that saved thing is, check this out. You see these eyeballs? That means that we're viewing our image right now. If I were to turn on the eyeball right here, doesn't that look like quick mask mode? The only difference is what's active right now is still the picture and not this. So if I paint, the paint wouldn't go in here. It'd go up here. But if I just type the letter Q when I have a selection, let me load that one. Load selection, fishy one. Now I'm going to hit Q. Watch the channels panel. It's weird. It's like, wait a minute. So what happens when you type Q is it temporarily saves your selection in there. Temporarily. And it just happens to turn on the eyeball up here. So you're seeing the picture and this at the same time. But what's active? What's highlighted? That thing. So if you grab any paint, you paint on your picture, that's where the paint goes. When I type Q again to turn it off, watch that thing. It goes away. So it's a temporary thing. So what they did when they came up with Quick Mask is they took this thing called channels and they tried to make it user-friendly. They tried to make it where people that are afraid of opening the channels panel, which is most average Photoshop users, could still do it without knowing they're doing it. Honestly. Okay? If you ever use Quick Mask, say you love channels because you were using channels blatantly. You just didn't have it open. People will say, I hate channels. If you've ever used a layer mask, it's a channel attached to a layer. Okay? So the words selection, mask, and channel are the same thing. It's just that a selection is temporary and looks like little marching ants. A channel is a saved version of that. And a mask is one of those things attached to something, like a layer. Okay? And it takes a while to get your head around that. But if you do, then you get less confused about terms that people use. Because you're like, should I use a selection or should I use a mask? And it's like, well, they mean the same thing. It's just a mask means it's attached to something. It's attached to a layer, or it's attached to an adjustment. And if it's not attached to something, it's a selection. If it's saved, but not attached to anything, it's just saved, it's a channel. Okay? So it's some concepts where the meaning is the same, but the wording is different, and it's just how it's being applied. It'll take you a while to get your brain around that. Okay? Yes, question?
So if I understand it, which I think I don't.
Yeah, it's fine. It takes time.
You've made a selection.
Yep.
It shows up in your channels.
Only if you save it.
Only if you save it.
Or
okay.
you turn on Quick Mask mode. Yeah.
Okay.
What happens is there's really a hidden channel. Anytime you have a selection on your screen, there's a hidden one it doesn't show you. It's saying there's one here, but we're not even going to show it to you because you haven't told me to save it. If you did, it would be there.
So if you go into Quick Mask mode,
You got a temporary channel.
you've got a temporary channel.
Yep.
Okay. So only saving it makes it a permanent channel.
Yes. Or there is one other thing you can do, not that it's going to help you, but if you type Q where it does the temporary one in there, watch my layer or my channels panel. I could drag it down here to say duplicate it, and now it'll stay there. Meaning the Quick Mask mode will go away when I type Q to turn it off, but since I duplicated it, I did something that would make it stay there. But that's something that you wouldn't usually need to do. But just so you know, Quick Mask means temporary channel overlaid on my picture. So, but channels, masks, and selections are concepts that will take your brain a while to get used to. Some people that have used Photoshop for 15 years still think a channel is different than a selection, which is different than a mask. Even though all of them are the same thing, they're just shown visually in different places, and they might just show the edges versus that overlay. Okay? So what can we do with some of this stuff? Well, a whole bunch of things. All a selection does is isolate something to say that that's the only thing I'm working on. That part right there. So if I grab the paintbrush and I want to paint, that's the only part where paint can show up. If I apply a filter, that's the only part that will be affected. If I add a mask, that'll get converted or attached to the layer. And I don't know how to show it as being attached to the layer when it looks like little marching ants like that, so they show it as a mask. And so selections, masks, and channels, they're all the same thing. Okay? So, all right. Questions relating to that? I'm sure there are probably a bunch that are hard to define.
Yeah, Betty wants to know, can you use a selection from one image to another?
Yeah, you can.
You can, okay.
Yes.
Yep. How would...
There are a couple ways of doing that. And let me see if I can describe how. I'm going to open another image.